So I'll try to sort of sketch out how I see things, but I really do hope also we will have a substantial amount of time for you, and maybe not only questions, but also reflections, because when I'm in Ireland today, it's also to get to know more about what is the discussion here, how are you seeing this. But some of you might think, this climate change thing, wasn't that just so much last year? Now it's economic crisis. We all know how tough it is. I also know it's very, very tough here in Ireland. Why bother with this? I'm not going into a lot of details on the climate science, just to give you one sort of, I think, telling thing. The last 12 months were the hottest last 12 months ever recorded in all the time we recorded temperatures in the world. Just one example why that when we saw it last year that climate change was an urgent issue, it still is an urgent issue. But I have this approach to the climate field that even the worst climate skepticist, even the person who really does not believe this and think that, oh, things will somehow be handled by nature or whatever they think, they will have to recognize that when we know that when my children are my age, we are going to be not 6.7 billion people on planet Earth like we are now, but 9 billion people, all wanting a share in the good life, all needing food, heating, cooling, modern commodities, and who were we to tell those who have not got a share in these things that now, sorry, we sort of came to the limit of what the planet could take. I mean, for this reason, on top of all the other reasons, but this is a very important reason, in any case, we need to address energy and resource efficiency. This is going to stay with us for a very, very long time. Because, you know, my background is being a Danish conservative, and I'm definitely sort of pro-growth. And I think the whole trick here is to find out not how we can stop growth, because that is not going to happen with the demographics that we can see worldwide, but how we can create a very different growth in the future than the one we created our growth with. That is basically what is at stake. And there I think that although, and I will not hide the fact that I'm sort of as a personality a rather impatient person, so sometimes I can also get absolutely desperate with the very, very slow speed with which things are moving forward, with which, for instance, the international negotiations are moving forward. But then sometimes if you look a bit back, and I think that goes for the Irish discussion as well. If you think back, where was this discussion, say, 2 years or 3 years ago in Ireland? Where was it 5 years ago? Then I think that you'll agree that somehow in recent years we have moved forward on the whole discussion about climate, energy, resources, and sort of more sustainable developments. And I also think that although Copenhagen did not deliver all the things that we, and definitely I myself, would very much have liked to see, then it's also true that if we have met here, say, 18 months back, then basically the European Union would have been the only region in the world who had set up targets and also made the effort sharing. But what happened in the run-up to Copenhagen was that despite the fact that we are talking about the worst economic crisis year for generations, we actually saw a number of countries joining the club of those who have domestic targets. Russia, last June, 6 months prior to Copenhagen, announced a much stronger target. So did the new government in Japan, and a number of countries for the first time ever set domestic targets. And not just sort of a lot of minor countries, but big countries also meaning big competitors seen from a European perspective, countries like Korea, Mexico, Brazil, India, South Africa, Indonesia. Indonesia has a very ambitious plan of reducing 26 to 42% compared to business as usual. Can you imagine what that means in a country like Indonesia with the growth needs they have? And in the end, up to Copenhagen, a few months before Copenhagen, actually also China, out of sync with their normal 5-year planning, came forward with a target up to 2020. Just to say that all other things being equal, seen from a European perspective, that was a rather important and significant development due to Copenhagen. And also in Copenhagen itself, you know what we sort of got around the fast start financing, the 2 degrees and all these things. But we got one more important thing. For the first time ever, the emerging economies accepted in the Copenhagen Accord and by signing up to it that the world cannot address the challenge of climate change unless they contribute. I guess that to most of you that seems only very logical, but if we again recall just 1 year before Copenhagen or something like that back, then it's a fact that a lot of these emerging economies still said, you, the West, the developed countries, you created the problem, you will have to solve it. As India said, we promise never to exceed you in emissions per capita. That was sort of the melody we heard up to half a year before Copenhagen, and then by Copenhagen they said, okay, we know we cannot solve it without our contribution as well. But as said, Copenhagen did not deliver all the things we needed. So what now? First, I would like to say that we were actually, the European Union, the first party to suggest what I call a stepwise approach. We suggested that in March, not because it was the easiest thing for us to do, because the easiest thing for Europe would have been to say, well, friends, we were ready to sign up to an internationally binding deal in Copenhagen, and we are still ready to do that. So please, Mexico, solve in Cancun all the things that we could not solve in Copenhagen. But we knew that it was too dangerous to try to create too high expectations for Mexico. Why? Because we could see already in the spring that whereas in Copenhagen the American administration thought that it was just a question of January, maybe February, then they would have their legislation passed through the Senate, then we could see by March it was not very likely that it was going to happen, not before summer recess. Then, if it did not happen before summer recess in the US, then it would not happen before the midterm election. And now the big fear, of course, is what will happen after midterm election. Without new signals coming out of Washington, it was also difficult to see how would we get new signals out of China. Let's face it, the lack of American legislation, of course, makes it more easy for other parties to, so to speak, hide behind the back of the US. That is the situation where we are in now. So what does a stepwise approach for Cancun mean? I'm not going into a lot of these negotiation details, but just to say what we are trying to get is a package of decisions. Decisions addressing substance. A decision on forestry, deforestation, ought to be within reach for Cancun, because that's one of the areas where Copenhagen actually delivered substantial progress. And the same can be said for the adaptation framework. Also here, we ought to be able to agree on a decision on an adaptation framework. Of course, the developed countries must deliver on their fast start pledges from Copenhagen. That is crucially important to the whole credibility. And also, we should have progress when it comes to a technology framework. But moreover, we in Europe think we should take care not just to sort of give the money, do some of the easy stuff now. Nothing is easy in the international climate negotiations, but relatively easy stuff. We must also try to address some of the more difficult political issues like MRV, how to measure, report, and verify whatever we agree upon, the transparency of the whole system, and hopefully we could also make progress in the carbon markets. These things could sort of be elements of a balanced package that could keep the momentum, prove to all the parties that there is something in it for them, and maybe if we can agree on substance, then it might be easier afterwards than to agree on the future legal form. That is sort of the thinking. Will we get it? I do not know. Europe will do whatever we can to achieve it, but we must take care that it is balanced, and it is not an easy thing. The political will was not present in Copenhagen. Let's be frank, if the political will is also not present in Cancun, then there is a risk that we lose momentum, that Cancun will deliver not much or maybe nothing at all. Then you could say, but is that such a huge problem? Because this UN process, isn't it just too slow and too irritating, to be frank? The last thing is for sure. It is slow, and it's very easy to see where the shortcomings in the international UN process are. But it is much more difficult to see what would be the alternative. I mean, those who believe that if we did not have the UN process, then we could just sort of gather, say, in G20, and then suddenly, miraculously, then we could agree. Well, first, China and India so far have said they do not want to discuss climate in G20. That's one obstacle. Could we then discuss it in G8? Makes no sense. Emerging economies are not present there. G2, China and the US had, I do not know how many meetings last year. How much came out of that? Just to say that we should not fool ourselves. It's not so that if just we found another forum, then suddenly the political obstacles would just disappear. And that is one of the reasons why I think it is really important to try to do whatever we can to push forward for a result in Cancun, and then try to sort of get the necessary compromise in order to be able to conclude things next year. Then there is a scenario. What if Cancun doesn't deliver a lot? Should we then, in Europe, sit down, wait until something happens? You know very well that we so far have said that we could do 20% reductions unilaterally, no matter what the rest of the world does. But if we should go forward to 30%, it's provided others also take a fair share. That's the position as it is of today. I believe that there is a paradox that we should acknowledge. A paradox that we, for instance, see with the Chinese, who for sure are not moving a lot around the negotiation table. But the paradox is that the Chinese are moving quite a lot in the real world. There are so many examples of that. And I think that we must really try to reflect. One thing is how to sort of play our cards vis-à-vis the international game. But there is also a portion of Europe's self-interest in this field. We could also say if we are being too complacent, really not moving a lot ahead in this field, what would be the result for us? Well, I would really fear that we would lose one of the strongholds that we have had so far. Europe is among the frontrunners when it comes to energy efficient, clean technologies. It has created a lot of jobs for us. It has created a lot of export possibilities for many of our member states. And it has served basically our economy well, because if we were not the most energy efficient region in the world, together with Japan, then we would have to import much more fossil fuel, much more gas from Russia, much more oil from the Middle East. So it has also served our economies well to try to address these issues and be among the frontrunners. And if there is one thing we know for sure in the world of the 21st century, then it is that the demand for energy efficient and resource efficient products will be increasing dramatically. It is foreseen that there will be a global growth in demand for energy efficient products at 10% per year for the next many years to come. To have a front-runner position in a market that grows to that dimension, that is, of course, worth a lot. That is why we in the European Commission have said, climate change is not just about climate change. Intelligent climate policies will also be about our energy policies, about energy security, energy efficiency. And it's also about jobs, growth, and innovation. Because if we do it intelligently, then we can have a climate policy where we pick the tools that at the same time will benefit climate, energy security, and jobs, growth, and innovation. That is basically what should be at stake. And that is also what you will find in the EU Commission's 2020 strategy. That's the way we see it. And we analyzed back in May in the Commission, where are we if we were going to go to 30%? What would be the cost? Nobody should believe that it's just easy, that it's just for free. But our analysis showed that compared to when our leaders 2.5 years back decided on the climate and energy package and the goals, 2020, then the price for going to 30% have come down with around 1/3. Why is that? That's of course due to the crisis. The crisis reduced our emissions, obviously, because our production was reduced. That, of course, was not good in itself. I mean, it was not good, obviously, that our production fell, that we have economic crisis. And in that sense, it was only logical that also emissions would drop and that the CO2 price would drop. That also, by the way, proved that the system we have built up works. When demand for allowances, CO2 allowances, dropped, then the prices fell. That is just the normal market functioning. But the problem is that due to the crisis and due to the fact that it became easier for us now to reach the 20% target, then we did not get the boost for innovation in our industries that we thought we would get when we made the climate and energy package. That is where we are today. And it's also so that we could see, and our analysis shows this, that for a very substantial number of years ahead, the price of emitting 1 ton of CO2 will remain low. Probably remain so low that there is a lack of incentive to invest in energy-efficient technologies. Why is that? Wouldn't it be so that when we have exited the crisis, then we are back to normal, and then prices would also come back to normal? No, that's not so. Because of the system where the emissions that we did not sort of emit, the allowances that companies did not use during the crisis, has, so to speak, been put into the bank and can be taken out for later when they need them. That is basically the reason why we can see that up to 2020, it is very likely that our CO2 price will continue to be low. Short-sighted seeing, that of course is good for business. Of course it is. But if we sort of look at it through the innovation lens, then of course it is not very good. And that is where I would like to end reflecting a bit on that, because, you know, I'm pretty concerned about Europe's situation. I know that some would say, okay, now we are having tough times, but soon we will be exiting the crisis and then we're back to normal. I'm not that sure of that. Of course, hopefully things will be addressed and be normal in a sense. But I think that the world around Europe is changing rather dramatically. The kind of competition that we are faced with is getting tougher and tougher. And I think that the very good question is, what are we going to live from in Europe? I mean, we cannot compete on wages. We cannot compete on taxes. We cannot compete on pension ages. We cannot compete on working hours. We have longer holidays than the Chinese, and so on and so forth. And there are many good reasons for all this. We also have chosen to have a rather expensive welfare model. And our citizens want to sort of preserve that system. But it means that in some fields we have to be really, really good to sort of make it competitive-wise. My view is that when we see the next 5-year plan of China, many Europeans will be in for surprises, because they are doing things, as I said, very rapidly in this field, and I think it will be reflected in that 5-year plan. And just to give you one example, in 2007, we in Europe invested double as much in energy efficient technologies as they did in China. 2 years after, in 2009, it was almost the same. First half of this year, 2010, we decreased in Europe. China increased very significantly. They are now ahead of us. I mean, we are not talking about 20, 30, 40 years time perspectives. This happened in 2.5 years, from a clear leading position to lagging behind. That's the kind of challenge that we are faced with. And that is why I basically think that we should not make it too complacent for ourselves. We have already reduced 17.3% in Europe compared to where we should be by the 20% by 2020. Now I know, of course, that this is an artificially good figure because it's reflecting the crisis. But still, for 6 years in a row, EU 27 have reduced our emissions substantially, and we are very well on track to meet the 20%. How can we move this discussion onwards? Well, in the spring, the Commission will come forward with a strategy for a low-carbon society in Europe for 2050. How do we get there? As you know, we have said in the international negotiations several years back, Europe will be ready to reduce 80 to 95% of our emissions by 2050. But it's not that difficult to set such a target. It's more difficult to define exactly how are we getting there. That's the kind of strategy we will present from the Commission in the spring. And including in this analysis, we will also present a target for 2030. Because for investors, 2020 is just around the corner. We should start already now to say, where do we need to be by 2030? That's the kind of discussion we also need to have. So that is one of the things that we are coming up with. But at the same time, the Commission will also come forward with an energy roadmap for 2050, presented by Commissioner Oettinger, and a white paper on transport, presented by Transport Commissioner Kallas. Just to say that we are not thinking it like this in each pillar. We're trying to think it in a more sort of cross-cutting way. I believe that when we present this 2050 low-carbon strategy, it will dawn on many that the more complacent we make it for ourselves by 2020, the more steep the reduction pathway in the years after 2020. And when it's going to be steep, it is also very likely that it's going to be very expensive. So we think that if we sort of have all these elements and the whole vision up to 2050 presented, then it might stimulate the discussion on these things. And at the same time, of course, we will also in Europe have the discussion over the next budget. And it could be interesting for some of the member states who have a huge potential still, for instance, in the field of energy efficiency, also to include what if we use the European budget much more targeted to get much more added value. That goes for the cohesion funds, social funds. It also goes for the agricultural subsidies, where, of course, there still will be agricultural subsidies, but maybe we could make it more targeted so that those who get subsidies of some kind will also have to live up to different things. So just to say, 2050 low-carbon strategy, energy roadmap, white paper on transport, and the budget, that will be some of the elements for having a coherent discussion about how do we actually move in the right direction seen from a European perspective. One of my last points would be, I know that some people would be very concerned. If we in Europe are ambitious in this field, while others are not equally ambitious, wouldn't it then mean that we risk losing a lot of jobs, for instance, to China, the so-called carbon leakage? I agree that, of course, you can make policies in this area which would be very, very unintelligent and where you only risk losing jobs. But I do think it's dangerous if we think that this carbon leakage is a one-way street. Because I think you can also lose jobs if you're not ambitious enough. So the whole trick is how to balance it the right way. There, of course, also in Europe, we can help with standards, with regulation, with the energy infrastructure, with building codes that will sort of stimulate retrofitting of buildings and so on and so forth. We could also sort of include some carrots in the system so that frontrunners will be rewarded and so on and so forth. I think that there is still a lot that can be done. And I think that it would be very, very useful for the whole European discussion if we were not only discussing whether we should be more ambitious, but we had a discussion about, okay, if we are going to be more ambitious, how could it then be done in the best, most cost-efficient and most intelligent way, where at the same time we could try to give a contribution to combat climate change, increase our own energy security, and at the same time stimulate the innovation that we need. I know that many businesses will think, oh, can we just focus on the crisis? But I do think that the task of the politicians is always to try to push business a bit more than they themselves want to be pushed, but then at the same time also try to listen to the input the other way around, and then by that finding the real balance. My profound view is if we don't do this right, then it's too late 10, 15, 20 years from now when we sort of have the energy to start to think about these things again, because what we can see from our competitors is that they do not wait 5, 10, 15 years to respond to challenges. They are doing it, and they are doing it right now, and by that they are challenging us, and that's why I think that it's very important that we have an informed discussion and a coherent discussion about how can we in Europe be more ambitious. I think in the end it will serve our interest best. Thank you.